The photograph was supposed to be ordinary, another stiff Victorian wedding portrait, another mute relic from an era when faces learned stillness as survival. For more than a century, historians had pointed to such images as proof of decorum, of restraint, brides unsmiling because exposure times demanded obedience from the body. But this one was different. The woman beneath the veil did not remain still because the camera required it. She remained still because she had been warned that if she moved, if she cried out, if she betrayed herself in any way, she would be culled. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The image hung for 120 years as an example of domestic harmony, reproduced in regional histories and museum pamphlets as a model of late 19th century respectability. No one questioned it. No one looked closely enough. Not until the estate of Silas Thorne, coal magnate, railroad investor, and one of Vermont's quiet industrial tyrants, was finally opened after decades of abandonment. Archivist Ben Miller found the photograph inside a wall safe, sealed behind rotting mahogany panels. The house itself stood on a hill above the old rail spur, its windows boarded, its floors sagging under the weight of disuse. Vermin had claimed the lower rooms. Rainwater streaked the plaster like old tears. The safe, however, had been spared. It was lined with oilcloth, its contents wrapped with care that suggested fear rather than sentiment. At first glance, the photograph showed exactly what the records promised: an 1894 wedding. The groom, Silas Thorne, stood rigid and unsmiling, his dark suit pressed into severity. Beside him stood his bride, face completely hidden behind a dense lace veil, so heavy it resembled drapery more than fabric. The veil swallowed her features entirely, falling straight and opaque, denying the viewer even the hint of a mouth or eyes. Her posture was upright, obedient, her body arranged with unnatural precision. Ben scanned it as part of routine digitization. It was only when the image expanded across his monitor, when the details sharpened beyond what the human eye could easily forgive, that something began to feel wrong. The bride's hands were visible. They rested low, clasped at her waist, partially obscured by lace cuffs. These were not the hands described in society pages of the time. Newspapers had praised Elizabeth Moore, the bride, as a cultivated young woman, a pianist educated in Boston, known for delicate fingers and artistic sensibility. Yet the hands in the photograph were broad. The palms looked thickened. The fingers were short, the knuckles enlarged, the nails cut close and uneven, bearing the faint abrasions of manual labor. They were hands shaped by work, not ivory keys. Ben adjusted contrast levels, leaned closer. On the bride's right wrist, just beneath the scalloped lace edge, a dark discoloration emerged, oval, deep, unmistakable. A bruise, the kind left by a forceful grip, the kind left by a man's fingers. He cross-checked the date. The marriage had been reported as joyous, prosperous, inevitable. A union between Silas Thorne and Judge Harold Moore's daughter, Elizabeth, timed precisely to secure a land merger essential for a new railroad extension. If the wedding failed to occur by November 15, 1894, contracts would collapse, fortunes would dissolve, reputations would burn. Ben stared at the screen long after the scan completed. The groom's hand rested on the bride's waist. Not gently, possessively. His thumb pressed inward, as if anchoring her in place. The distance between his body and hers was wrong. Too close, too controlling, devoid of ceremony. The longer Ben looked, the more the photograph ceased to feel like a document of celebration. It felt staged, forced, like a performance held together by threat. Someone had stood beneath that veil, knowing she could not speak, knowing that stillness was not etiquette, but obedience. And for 120 years, no one had noticed the hands. Not until the archive betrayed its own lie. Ben Miller did not trust instinct alone. Archives had taught him caution. Photographs lied easily, and the past resisted neat conclusions. Still, The hands troubled him enough that he delayed cataloging and requested assistance. He brought the scan to Sarah Whitcomb, a fashion historian whose work focused on late 19th century ceremonial dress, weddings, mourning attire, the subtle codes stitched into fabric. They met in the reading room beneath a ceiling stained by decades of coal smoke, the photograph projected between them like an accusation. Sarah studied the veil first. She said nothing for a long time. Then she leaned forward, her voice measured. "This isn't standard bridal lace," she said. "It's too dense, almost upholstery weight." Veils in the 1890s were symbolic, not obscuring. This one was designed to conceal. Together, they reconstructed the public story. In 1894, the marriage of Silas Thorne and Elizabeth Moore had been treated as inevitable. Thorne controlled coal lands and rolling stock. Judge Moore owned strategic parcels, cutting through the Green Mountain Corridor. The railroad project required continuity, one unified holding. Contracts were drafted with dates embedded like threats. If the wedding failed to occur by November 15th, both families would face catastrophic financial penalties. Investors would withdraw. Credit would evaporate. Newspapers would circle. The engagement announcement framed it as romance. Private correspondence suggested otherwise. Sarah traced the sleeves with a gloved finger on the screen. "The dress is correct in silhouette," she said, "but the tailoring is careless. Look here. Shoulder line, neckline tension. It doesn't fit the body beneath it." They began where historians usually begin, with the most charitable explanation. Elizabeth Moore, by all accounts, had been frail in the weeks before the ceremony. Society pages mentioned exhaustion, a nervous fever, and sudden seclusion. Visitors were politely refused. Rumors circulated, smallpox perhaps, or a visible injury that might alarm guests. That, Sarah suggested, could explain the veil. Dense fabric to hide lesions, gloves to conceal swelling or sores, silence to avoid scrutiny. Ben wanted to believe this version. Illness was common. Families hid weakness as reflex. The 19th century had no patience for female vulnerability unless it served narrative convenience. They searched medical journals, wedding customs, court etiquette. Nothing quite matched the extremity of concealment in the photograph. Even brides with facial scarring revealed themselves briefly for documentation. Even quarantined ceremonies left traces of explanation. "And the hands?" Ben asked. Sarah hesitated. "Injury could explain roughness. Fever can damage nails. Swelling distorts joints. But bruises don't appear spontaneously," Ben replied. They reviewed the timeline. Elizabeth was last seen in public 11 days before the wedding. After that, silence. The house closed. The ceremony was advanced by 2 days, citing concern for her health. The photograph was taken quickly, not as a keepsake but as proof, distributed to banks and partners within a week. "That part matters," Sarah said. "This wasn't sentiment. This was documentation." The initial hypothesis took shape reluctantly. Elizabeth Moore had been ill or injured, hidden for dignity, veiled to preserve appearances. A family protecting assets, not committing a crime. Yet the hypothesis strained under its own weight. The veil was too heavy, the posture too rigid, the groom's grip too firm. And illness did not explain why the bride's hands looked as though they belonged to someone who had scrubbed floors and carried loads. By the end of the week, Ben noted something else in his log. The language used in reports surrounding the wedding was defensive, excessively precise. Dates, signatures, witnesses, all emphasized, as though the event itself were fragile, requiring reinforcement. Sarah closed her notebook and looked again at the projected image. "If this is illness," she said quietly, "then someone was very afraid of being seen." And fear, Ben had learned, usually pointed not to sickness, but to exposure. The photograph resisted closure. Every attempt to classify it under ordinary explanation left residue, details that refused to settle. Ben returned to the scan late at night, when the archive lights hummed softly and the building felt emptied of witnesses. He reran the image through enhanced filters, normally reserved for damaged negatives, ultraviolet simulation, depth exaggeration, contrast isolation. The software pulled at shadows the way a confession pulls at memory. That was when the dress began to fail. The shadow cast along the bride's left side did not follow the body beneath it. Instead, it broke unnaturally at the shoulder, as if the fabric were collapsing inward, where it should have been filled. Ben zoomed further. The lace pattern stretched unevenly across the bodice, distorted not by posture, but by excess cloth. The shoulders were too wide. The neckline sagged forward, pinned into place. Pinned. In the far background of the photograph, an area long dismissed as decorative blur, stood a gilt-framed mirror. Its presence was accidental, likely part of the studio's reused furniture. But mirrors do not forget. At high magnification, the mirror reflected the bride's back at an oblique angle. There, beneath the cascade of lace, a series of dark punctures appeared along the spine. Safety pins. Hastily placed. The dress had been taken in minutes before exposure. This wasn't tailored, Ben murmured. It was forced to fit. He cross-referenced the studio's appointment ledger. The wedding portrait had been booked only 12 hours in advance, unheard of for a family of that status. The photographer noted limited sitting time and no adjustments requested. No retakes. As Ben expanded the search outward, the human record began to fray. In the county police archive, buried among firewood thefts and livestock disputes, he found a single-line notation dated November 12, 1894, 3 days before the wedding. Annie H., domestic servant, age approx. 22. Reported missing from Moore household. No evidence of flight. Inquiry suspended at request of family. No surname, no follow-up. The ink thinned mid-sentence, as if the clerk had been interrupted or instructed to stop. Ben sat back. Annie. A maid. A body close enough in size to wear another woman's dress if pinned tight enough. A body without standing, without defense. The society pages completed the misdirection. On the same day the maid vanished, newspapers announced that Elizabeth Moore had taken ill with a fever and would receive no callers. Curtains were drawn. Doctors named but never quoted. The household sealed itself. The dates aligned with a cruelty too precise to be coincidence. Ben reconstructed the days leading up to the ceremony. Silence. A missing servant. A rushed photograph. A veil thick enough to erase identity. This was not concealment of illness. It was substitution. He imagined the atmosphere inside the Moore house. Doors locked, voices lowered, time collapsing. Panic disguised as efficiency. Men calculating loss. Women instructed to obey. Somewhere in that house, a girl named Annie being told what would happen if she refused. Told what crime she could be accused of. Told what fate awaited women without names. The photograph was no longer static. It became kinetic in Ben's mind. The weight of the veil pressing down, the pins biting into skin, the groom's grip not ceremonial, but corrective. The bride's stillness was not compliance. It was survival, and beneath all of it, the real Elizabeth Moore vanished from the record entirely, absorbed into the fiction of illness, then erased. Ben closed the file at dawn. The archive felt colder. The photograph, once presented as evidence of unity, had revealed itself as a frame around fear. This was no wedding portrait. It was a hostage image. Once the substitution became unavoidable, the reconstruction followed with a grim, mechanical clarity. There was no need for speculation, only alignment. Every document, every silence, every distortion in the photograph pointed toward a narrow window of catastrophe in the days before November 15th, 1894. Elizabeth Moore disappeared 3 days before her wedding. No carriage departure was recorded. No ticket purchased under her name. No letter of explanation preserved. Yet absence itself can speak. Elizabeth had resisted the match privately for months, according to a fragment of correspondence found later in Judge Moore's personal effects. Letters never sent, folded and refolded until the paper weakened. She wrote of Thorne's temper, of his reputation among workers, of a marriage that felt less a union than an annexation. The language was careful, but the fear bled through. On the night of November 11th, she fled. Whether she ran alone or was intercepted before she reached the road remains unresolved. What matters is that by morning she was gone, and her father understood the implications immediately. The contracts were explicit. Failure to produce a bride meant financial ruin and public humiliation. Thorne, whose investments were already overextended, would be exposed. The railroad would collapse. Both men would be reduced to cautionary tales. They did not search for Elizabeth. They searched for a solution. Annie, the maid, had worked in the Moore household since adolescence. She was described in payroll records as reliable, quiet, physically capable. She shared Elizabeth's height and general build. She knew the house. She knew the consequences of refusal. The police note suggested no evidence of flight. That phrasing mattered. Annie did not run. She was taken. The bruise on her wrist told the rest of the story. She was restrained, threatened, and presented with a choice that was not a choice at all. Obedience meant survival. Resistance meant accusation of theft, of impropriety, of crimes easily assigned to servants without defense. The law would not protect her. It would consume her. The dress was brought out. Elizabeth's dress. Too large at the shoulders, too long in the bodice. Pinned quickly, brutally. The veil was selected not for modesty, but for erasure. It transformed a living person into an object, an outline without identity. The ceremony itself was rushed. Guests later described it as oddly subdued, efficient, lacking warmth. The priest asked no unnecessary questions. The vows were short. The bride spoke barely above a whisper, coached in advance to answer only when prompted. The photograph followed immediately after. This was the critical moment, the one that mattered. Thorne needed proof. Banks required evidence. Partners demanded documentation. The image would travel where the bride could not speak. The photographer noticed nothing, or noticed and said nothing. Studios depended on patrons like Thorne. Silence was part of the business model. Annie stood beneath the veil, knowing that if she moved, if she faltered, if she reached for help, the consequences would be immediate. The groom's hand anchored her, his grip calibrated not for intimacy, but control. The exposure lasted seconds. The fear lasted longer. Afterward, Elizabeth Moore did not return. No recovery, no convalescence, no reemergence. Society accepted the narrative that illness had weakened her constitution, that marriage required rest and privacy. Silence was rebranded as refinement. Annie became Mrs. Thorne. She moved into a house that was not hers, under a name she could barely sign, bound to a man she had not chosen. Her body served as collateral for a contract she did not understand. The law recognized her transformation. The truth did not matter. In the end, the tragedy was not impulsive. It was procedural. A series of decisions made quickly, cleanly, by men accustomed to treating people as interchangeable components in larger mechanisms. The photograph captured the exact moment when that mechanism locked into place. And Annie, whoever she had been before, disappeared as thoroughly as Elizabeth Moore. Proof does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, folded and hidden, preserved not by intention but by fear. Ben found it where he almost did not look, beneath a false bottom in the same safe that had protected the wedding photograph for over a century. The compartment was shallow, its edges smoothed by repeated access. Whatever had been hidden there was meant to be retrieved, not forgotten. Inside lay a ledger bound in cracked leather. It was not a household account book, but a private register, payments, dates, initials instead of names. Coal shipments, legal fees, quiet disbursements, and tucked between two brittle pages, folded until the creases nearly dissolved the paper, was a single sheet torn from a diary. The handwriting was uneven, cramped, as if written in poor light or with shaking hands. The language was simple. There was no flourish, no education hiding beneath the words. They told me if I lift the veil, they will say I stole the silver. They said I would hang. I am not Annie anymore. They say I am Mrs. Thorne now. I do not know where Miss Elizabeth is. I do not think she is coming back. There was no date. None was needed. Ben sat with the page for a long time, afraid to breathe too deeply. This was not interpretation. It was testimony. The voice of the woman in the photograph, speaking from inside the lie that had swallowed her. The page answered the question that had lingered since the police note. Annie had not vanished. She had been absorbed, renamed, reassigned. But the document did something else. It implied knowledge Annie should not have had, an awareness that Elizabeth Moore's disappearance was permanent, not illness, not travel. Something final enough to inspire certainty. Ben followed the thread forward. Silas Thorne died just 3 months after the wedding, officially of heart failure. Newspapers framed it as tragic irony. A man who secured his legacy only to be taken by fate. The widow, Elizabeth Thorne, was praised for her composure, her silence, her dignified withdrawal from society. The will was filed promptly. Ben requested the original. The document named Elizabeth Thorne as sole heir. No surprise, but the signature stopped him cold. Where Elizabeth Moore's handwriting had once flowed in looping precision, the signature here was nothing more than an X, crude, pressed hard enough to tear the paper fibers. And beside it, the clerk's notation, mark of the widow. An educated woman did not sign her name with an X. Annie did. The substitution had not ended with the photograph. It had hardened into permanence. The maid had become the wife in the eyes of the law, inheriting property she could not fully comprehend, bound to a role she could never abandon without destroying herself. Elizabeth Moore's fate remained unrecorded. No death certificate, no grave, no later sightings. Her absence was complete enough to suggest intention. Whether she died during her escape or was intercepted and eliminated to prevent exposure, the result was the same. She was erased to protect the contract. Annie lived on as Elizabeth Thorne. Records showed charitable donations, careful investments, minimal public appearances. She never remarried. She left no children. When she died decades later, she was described as reclusive but respectable. Wealth without intimacy, security without freedom. The proof lay not in one document, but in the convergence of many. The diary fragment, the pinned dress, the bruise, the signature that refused literacy. Together they revealed a truth too dangerous to surface, while any participant still lived. The wedding photograph had not captured a beginning. It had captured a takeover. And once the substitution succeeded, there was no incentive to ever undo it. Once the substitution was understood, the photograph ceased to be mysterious and became precise. Every choice embedded within it, every pose, every omission, revealed intention. The image had not been created to remember a wedding. It had been created to validate a transaction. Silas Thorne did not commission the photograph for sentiment. He commissioned it for leverage. In 1894, marriage was not merely a social ritual among industrial elites. It was a binding mechanism. Banks required proof. Investors demanded assurance. Railroad syndicates, particularly those operating on borrowed capital, needed documentary evidence that land transfers tied to marriage contracts were legitimate. The photograph functioned as a portable affidavit, visual confirmation that the union had occurred and that the contractual chain remained unbroken. This explained the haste, the absence of retakes, the insistence on full concealment. The veil was not an aesthetic flourish, but a tool. It transformed a specific individual into a symbolic placeholder, the bride. Identity was irrelevant as long as the outline remained convincing. The photographer's ledger confirmed the priority. The prints were rushed, multiple copies ordered immediately. One sent to a Boston bank, another to a New York legal office, a third to Thorne's principal investor. None intended for a family album. The image was evidence. Seen through this lens, the composition revealed its true violence. The groom's posture was not celebratory. It was assertive, his hand pressed firmly against the bride's waist, fingers splayed in a way that restricted movement. This was not affection. It was containment, an unspoken instruction to remain still until the shutter closed. The bride's stillness, once interpreted as Victorian restraint, now read as enforced discipline. She stood not as a participant, but as collateral. Her body was required to complete the frame. Her silence ensured the image's usability. Even the background choices reinforced the function. Neutral drapery, no personal objects, no identifying details that could invite scrutiny. The photograph was designed to circulate without context, to be accepted without question. In effect, the image performed the same work as a forged signature. It authenticated a lie with sufficient plausibility to satisfy institutions that preferred certainty over truth. And the institutions complied. The photograph moved freely through financial networks, while the woman inside it remained trapped. It was shown to men who nodded approval, who released funds, who initialed contracts that reshaped landscapes and displaced communities. Rail lines were laid, towns expanded, wealth accumulated, all resting in part on a moment of coerced stillness beneath lace. This was the photograph's real purpose, not to preserve memory, but to erase discrepancy. Elizabeth Moore's absence became irrelevant once the image existed. Annie's presence became invisible once her role was complete. The photograph absorbed both women into a single, acceptable fiction that satisfied the machinery of capital. When museums later displayed the image as an emblem of domestic harmony, they unknowingly completed its final function. The lie was no longer merely practical, it became historical. The violence was aestheticized, the coercion reframed as tradition. What hung on the wall for 120 years was not a wedding portrait, it was a receipt, a confirmation that a human being had been successfully substituted, restrained, and converted into proof. Her terror flattened into documentation, her identity compressed into lace and posture. And as long as the photograph remained uninterrogated, the crime it recorded remained complete. The truth surfaced too late to punish anyone who mattered. By the time Ben Miller compiled his findings, by the time the photograph was stripped of its innocence and returned to its proper place as evidence, the people who had engineered the substitution were long dead. Their wealth had been laundered through generations. Their names adorned libraries, rail depots, scholarships. The law had closed its eyes at precisely the moment it was most needed, and time had sealed the rest. Elizabeth Moore was never found. There was no grave bearing her name, no travel record confirming escape, no correspondence from a distant city written under an assumed identity. Her disappearance was absolute enough to suggest intention. A woman who vanished on the eve of a contract-threatening wedding was not a loose-end men like Thorne and Judge Moore could tolerate. Whether Elizabeth died during her flight, was intercepted before she reached safety, or was quietly eliminated and folded into the silence of family records, remains unknown. The archive does not say. The archive rarely does. Annie lived. That fact complicated the ending more than Ben expected. As Elizabeth Thorne, she inherited a fortune that could have purchased freedom in any practical sense, yet she never used it to escape the role imposed upon her. She remained in the house, withdrew from society, conducted business through intermediaries, and avoided attention with disciplined precision. Wealth protected her, but it also bound her. Any attempt to reveal the truth would have exposed her to prosecution, ridicule, or worse. The lie that had saved her life had become the structure of it. She never corrected the signature in the records, never learned to write the name she carried. Every legal document bore the same mark, an X, patiently accepted by clerks who preferred not to ask why a cultured widow required assistance with a pen. She died decades later, described in her obituary as a woman of quiet habits and considerable means. No mention of children, no intimates, no mourners beyond distant beneficiaries and institutions that inherited portions of her estate without ever knowing its origin. Silas Thorne's railroad succeeded. Tracks cut through land that had once belonged to others. Towns rose where forests fell. Coal moved. Money flowed. The photograph, its original purpose fulfilled, was reframed as heritage, its violence diluted into nostalgia. When the museum finally removed it from public display, the wall behind it showed a lighter rectangle where it had hung for generations. Visitors asked why it was gone. Staff offered neutral explanations. Conservation, reclassification, ongoing research. The truth was more uncomfortable. Once you know what the image contains, you cannot unknow it. The lace becomes suffocating. The stillness becomes terror. The groom's hand becomes a threat frozen mid-act. The photograph refuses passive viewing. It demands acknowledgement. Yet acknowledgement does not restore what was taken. Elizabeth Moore remains a missing woman without justice. Annie remains a survivor without absolution. The men who orchestrated the crime remain honored, their reputations untroubled by the mechanism that sustained them. The photograph returns to the archive, now labeled accurately, not as a wedding portrait, but as evidence of fraud, coercion, and erasure. It is stored flat, in darkness, its edges stabilized, its surface protected. The institution has done everything possible to preserve it. Everything except redeem it. Behind the veil, the woman still stands where she was placed, obeying the command to remain still. The exposure has long since ended, but the silence continues. And that silence, maintained for 120 years, is the final consequence of the crime.